Today we're going to be talking about the film analysis essay. And how to go about writing said essay. There are 5 elements of film. This is going to be the basis for our essay: narrative, cinematography, sound, mise-en-scene, editing. We'll talk about these as we go through. First one is narrative. That is, of course, the story of the film. What is the film saying and how is it saying it? There's 3 elements of narrative: story, characters, setting. Those are the 3 things that you would look at whenever you're looking at narrative. Story is going to include plot, conflict, rising action, falling action. It will also include how the conflict is resolved at the end. Characters are how the characters are developed, how the characters change throughout the course of the story, anything that makes them unique from other characters. And of course, the setting is where the story takes place and how that influences the actual narrative, as we can see. All right. 2 good examples are a couple of animated films: Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and whatever that movie is called. So these 2 films are great narrative examples. Cinematography is our second element of film. It is essentially how the camera moves in the film. It's going to include stuff like camera angles, lit, framed, toned, colored, just like photography. So whenever you go to take a selfie and you're considering which angle is the best way to shoot yourself from, it's exactly what happens in cinematography. You want to pick the best angle for the shot to tell the story. So those are your 4 sort of five main areas: camera angles, camera movements, shot sizes, lighting, and composition. So those are the ones that we'll be paying the closest attention to when we're writing about cinematography. How these 5 things can sort of tell the story in the scene a little bit more than what the characters or narrative are doing. Here's a bunch of examples from different films that show different camera angles, different movement. Just even looking at the pictures, you can almost get a pretty concise storyline there. Sound is our third element of film. It is composed of 3 main elements: dialogue, sound effects, and music. Obviously, music is the most recognizable. We talk about music a lot, especially when it comes to soundtracks or film scores. How do those add to the film? Dialogue and sound effects, a little more subdued, are essential. So we do want to make sure that we're telling the story through dialogue. Are there any lines in your film that are especially important that you feel like add to the overall idea of the story a little bit more? Are there any sound effects that really help establish one sort of theme over another? The main one I always think of is Star Wars and the sound of the lightsaber. Mise-en-scene is the 4th element of film. We see here, it means literally translates into putting into the scene. That is a shot from a movie by Alfred Hitchcock called Vertigo, in which the main character has vertigo, and every time he climbs upstairs, he gets this sort of dizzy feeling. To give that impression, what Hitchcock did was he built staircases on their side and put them on wheels, and then just set the camera up at the end and moved them to give it this sort of feeling. Mise-en-scene is probably the most important, especially when it comes to talking about symbolism in the film. So it's what the director controls every aspect of the film and was first applied to directing plays. The main thing here is our 4 elements of mise-en-scene: our setting, lighting, costume, and behavior of the figures. We're going to talk about each of those in detail here as we go through this. Georges Méliès was the first person to actually use mise-en-scene. He was the magician turned filmmaker, and I always tell the story of him setting up a camera and filming a bus driving by, but then it jammed, and when he got it back going again, a hearse was driving by, and when he watched it later, it looked like the bus was turning into a hearse. So he was one of the first studios. We talked about him last semester in our history of film, but this is him down there in the left-hand corner, and up in the top right, one of the most famous shots from his most famous movie, A Trip to the Moon, where they land in the moon's eye. And then this is a shot from his other film called The Mermaid. I always find this one interesting because he just had a woman lying on a table, built this big tail over her lower half, and then put a aquarium between her and the camera so that it looked like there were fish swimming around over the top of her. There are 4 areas of mise-en-scene. As we said, these are the 4 areas. We'll talk about each of those in detail. Now, setting we talked about with narrative. It's going to be slightly different when it comes to mise-en-scene. So how does it enter how does it enter this story a little bit more? A couple of examples: Castaway and Rudderless. Castaway, of course, he lands on a deserted island. Totally changes the tone of the entire story. Rudderless is about a guy who loses his child but reconnects with him through his favorite things, playing guitar and sailing. And so Lake Hefner, that is there in the background, becomes a part of the narrative in that way. The filmmaker can control the setting in 3 different ways: already existing locales, constructing the setting, and also using an existing setting for emphasized authenticity. That is from The Imitation Game, and it was filmed in the exact building where the actual historical thing took place. And then, of course, one of my favorite shots from the movie Rain Man, where Dustin Hoffman is walking through the downtown streets of Guthrie, Oklahoma. Props are an object in the setting, and they can become motifs. An example of a motif in the setting is the guitar in Coco. Another example is Inigo Montoya's sword, representing his quest for revenge. And so as you watch your film, you'll probably see props, but which props become important? Those are the ones you want to focus on. Another example, of course, is the towel. Costume and makeup can also lean itself into authenticity. An example there is the film Tombstone. They are meant to look like it is the Wild West. And then, of course, stylized costumes can also bring a lot of detail. So something that Baz Luhrmann is famous for. And so here's an example from his film The Great Gatsby. You'll see this in Moulin Rouge. You'll see this in Romeo and Juliet. Over-the-top stylized costuming. And then, of course, costumes and makeup can also represent important motifs or symbolism of the characters. We see that in the film Grease, where you've got your characters wearing their personalities, wearing pink because they're the pink ladies, wearing leather because they're the greasers, that whole sort of thing. And then a reinforcement of the narrative. Narrative thematic patterns. These include, of course, the Hunger Games and Star Wars. There's a couple of examples. In the Hunger Games, you get a lot of that symbolism through their costume because of the costume parades that they go on, and that sort of thing. So you get a constant reminder that Katniss is the girl on fire or is the Mockingjay. And then a really good example from Star Wars Episode 8, which is probably everybody's least favorite Star Wars movie. You have Rey wearing normally wearing white. representing, of course, her goodness, her purity, that kind of thing. But later on, when she is conflicted over whether or not she should join Kylo Ren and the dark side, she is wearing dark gray, representing her conflict, whether that is going to the dark side or to the light side. And then we go into makeup. Makeup has all kinds of interesting things that can add to it, and obviously was once upon a time used to just basically show their faces on film because film was so crappy. Um, Obviously, now we're using more CGI, we're using more animation, we're using more things like that instead of practical makeup. But it is, of course, still very useful in biographies and in other types of films where you want to show their faces a little bit. Here's an example of Frida. On the right is Selma Hayek playing Frida. On the left is the actual Frida. And then, of course, you've got Gollum, the transition of Gollum from Andy Serkis in his white suit to developing into a CGI character. That is over 20 years old now, so it has not aged as well because CGI just doesn't age well. Brad Pitt in the movie Curious Case of Benjamin Button, where he ages backwards. Lots and lots of CGI used there, but also some makeup as well. And then one of my favorite examples of use of makeup is from the movie, what is that called? Anyway, where you've got Robert Downey Jr. playing a British guy who is also like a blonde-haired, blue-eyed British guy who is playing a black man in what he thinks is a movie. It's fantastic. And then finally, Benedict Cumberbatch in The Hobbit playing Smaug, the Great and Terrible. And you can see the difference between Gollum and Smaug and how we have had an advancement in technology since then. Lighting is our next element of mise-en-scene, creating highlights and shadows. There's 4 major aspects of lighting: quality, direction, source, and color. Hard lighting. Here's an example of hard lighting. You get that really harsh sort of look at things, and it kind of casts our characters into shadow, almost a silhouette. Soft lighting, where you have Dumbledore here surrounded by just this soft white light, giving him a very heavenly look. Then we have filter lighting, which is blue in this case. You've got The Exorcist here, and everything has this very sort of blue tinge. Blue is probably the most common color that is filtered because it gives a certain sort of emotional appeal to it. And then finally, the last stage of mise-en-scene is staging, movement, and performance, or the way that the actor moves. In speech class, we call this blocking. So the director is able to control all of these things, and it's just one more way to control mise-en-scene. Obviously, the actor's performance consists of visual elements and sound. Here's an example of Peter Jackson showing Samwise Gamgee how he wants him to act. And again, later on in The Hobbit, you got Peter Jackson showing them, I don't know, how to be in barrels. I don't know what he's done. And then motif is not an element of film. It's just another element that we might want to add to this and consider. And so we get something like the house in, what is that called? Whatever. So we get any kind of element that has symbolic significance as it's recurring. And so we can think of a lot of props, we can think of settings, we can think of costumes. So we can think of lots of different things that can become motif, and all a motif is just this thing that can kind of become symbolic as you're looking through it. We'll see this in literature as well, not just in film. And then, of course, editing is our final element of film, We have three major aspects of editing: continuity, montage, juxtaposition. There's a lot on this slide that I wouldn't really worry too much about. It's just really explaining what continuity editing is. But it did start with the idea of just putting the film in order, because films are not filmed in order most of the time. And so it was really just a matter of like making sure that the story is told in a continuous like way that stories should be told. Now continuity also applies to ensuring that everything from shot to shot is the same. That's usually where you get a lot of errors in films. And so we usually have some good editing techniques to stitch these things together in the final product. Juxtaposition. We have actually watched a bunch of juxtaposition scenes lately. We watched the scene from 500 Days of Summer where we had reality versus expectations. We watched the scene from, well, I can't think of it. But we've watched several scenes that have juxtaposition. It's just putting two different scenes together to give a contrasting idea. And then, of course, a montage is a technique of film editing where you just throw a bunch of shots and series of things together to reduce time, space, information. You'll see this a lot of times with like athlete films, sports movies, where you have somebody who's going from fat and out of shape to in shape and healthy and buff in a matter of minutes, right? Because it's a workout montage. That's you get Sylvester Stallone running up the stairs in front of the Philadelphia Library. You get whatever, like those kinds of scenes. But that's all a montage is. A really great example of a montage is the opening for the film Up, and the way that they show the progression of characters from children to adults. This brings us to a universal theme. And this is just the universal idea that is understood across cultures, and it's central to the story. You don't have to talk about a universal theme, but it can be a helpful way to sort of look at your film. So here's 10 universal themes. These are the most common universal themes in reverse order. The number one most common universal theme is good versus evil. And we see that in almost every literary story. Even the Bible is ultimately a good versus evil story. These are the essay requirements. You have to have 5 pages, a thesis statement, MLA format, write about at least 3 of the 5 elements of film. You can write about an underlying theme in your film, but you don't have to. You also need to find at least one source to back up the claims of your essay, not including your film. So that means you'll have to have a works cited page at the very end of your essay to show where you got your information. And good luck.